University Heights was unique because it was one of the first neighborhoods that was actually designed with the intent of having a garage and an automobile. It was also a restricted neighborhood in the sense of its building design. So where somebody like that lived in Phelps Grove or Roundtree, which were older, you take Pickwick Place going back to 1890. Then you have like Colonial Place to the north of Phelps Grove, and that's like 1908. This one, since it was designed in 1925, they've opted to put on there the houses had to be built of brick, stucco, or stone. So that really kind of limited what it could be. And then so financially, that was more expensive than wood. And this was supposed to be considered a mid-upper white-collar neighborhood. And so a lot of folks, when they moved down there, it was on the cusp of the city limits because the city limits was Sunshine.
Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. My special guest today is Richard Crabtree. Richard is a self-trained historian known in Springfield for his encyclopedic knowledge of Springfield neighborhoods. He comes by his interest in history honestly. He can trace his family back to the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, and his ancestors have served on both sides in the Civil War and in World War I, World War II, and Korea. Richard grew up in the St. Louis area where he covered sports for the high school newspaper, and then after college started working for the Alton Telegraph and the St. Louis Globe. That was in 1981. In 1997, he took a job in Springfield as a pharmaceutical salesman. But then the Affordable Care Act came along in about 2008, and that made changes about how pharmaceuticals were sold. So Richard started a new career, selling real estate here in Springfield. Since 2007, he has researched the history of hundreds of homes and neighborhoods in Springfield. Presently, he manages 10 Facebook pages covering history in Springfield, Taney County, and Shannon County. He has over 30,000 followers. And he is a frequent speaker to local groups wanting to know about their neighborhood's history. Richard, welcome to In Our Town.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, I'm excited to have you here and have you tell our listeners about what you do. It's fascinating. Obviously, a lot of people enjoy what you're producing. When you came to Springfield in, I guess, about 2007, where was the first house you bought?
Well, in 2007, my wife and I were living in Ozark, and unfortunately, she got stuck on an icy hill and decided that we need to move to Springfield. So I decided that we were going to find an older home to restore, and we fell in love with the Bisman-style homes that were out there, and we latched on to one in University Heights that happened to be a Tudor house that he had built in 1934. And at that time, we were watching a TV show on HGTV called If Walls Could Talk. And we just hoped that somebody was going to show up and give us a plethora of information and pictures and blueprints and all that stuff. And it's like, nah, well, nobody was coming. And so I started asking around, well, surely there's a depository here in Springfield that has that sort of thing. And no, I had to start doing a lot of research. So that led me to get to know the folks at the Greene County Archives and the History Museum. Of course, that was when they were still in City Hall. And, of course, the Greene County Library. And that was where I spent hours upon hours until my eyes were bleeding looking at microfilm. And once I found my house, I thought, boy, wouldn't it be interesting if I could share this information with my neighbors? I started researching their houses. And that kind of led to the block and then the neighborhood and Phelps Grove, and we just kept going and going.
I see. Now you've reduced it to an art form, I suppose, but what are the main sources that you would go to in the first instance to get a background on a home?
Sure. Well, today it's so much easier because when I first started, like I said, I pretty much physically had to go to places. There wasn't a lot online. So now today, what I first do is I get online and look at the Library of Congress Sanborn maps to confirm what the address is and was.
And that's something anybody could do.
Anybody can do that. And then the next step would be to go to newspapers.com. And you have to use a subscription for that. That's not something the Library Center has. And then that way you can dig through there and look for names and or the address and so forth. And then to help correlate all that, I also look on Ancestry and then look in the city directories and then the census data. So between all that, I can get a good synopsis of where the people were who lived there, the background of the house. If I can't exactly pinpoint a date because there's some sources that are limited, then I have to physically go back to the Greene County archives and pull out the very large, heavy tax books. And those are quite accurate. So those I know I can exactly pinpoint down when somebody's house was built.
But still, sometimes you have to actually do some, I guess I would call it legwork, because there may be a family that lived in a house 20 years, but they didn't own it.
That's correct. Yeah, because a lot of times in the archives, it's going to be who owned the house, which doesn't have any bearing on who actually lived there. And a lot of people think rentals are a newer concept, and it's like, no, rentals have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so there were many houses that were built, sometimes side by side, and the person would live in one, rent out the other for most of its existence. So that's why I always ask people when they ask me to do a history, it's like, well, do you want to know who owned it or who lived there?
Right.
Of course, they say both.
Well, and with your access to the information, if searching the house at 820 Stanford, for example, you know that a group lived there from 1990 to 2000, and there are probably still some neighbors. So I bet you can go talk to the people in the area and fill in a lot of blanks and shade it in around the edges. Huh?
Oh, sure. And I do count on that, as I like to call that, the local color that people have that they can describe. Because I'm a numerical kind of guy. So I've just got the facts and figures. I don't have, unless it's in the paper, I don't have the stories that kind of go along with it. So that's been the fun of some of my history talks and being on Facebook and stuff. People have filled me in with some things that I can talk about, some I can't. But it's like, wow, okay, so there's a lot more to it than just what's in the paper.
You told me when we were visiting about doing this podcast over coffee that once you got started, you created a newsletter when going through the neighborhood and hanging it on the doorknobs. Talk about that.
Sure. Well, I wanted to differentiate myself from all my other colleagues that are out there and to physically go on everybody's doorstep in the neighborhood and hang a newsletter. I thought, well, this is going to be the way, because I thought of myself from a marketing perspective, because that's my background. If I mail it, there's a very good chance it's just going to be lumped in with the mail and tossed. People aren't going to read it. But I found, and I physically watch people, if I put it on the door, especially with this big newsletter, people tend to take it up, and whether they were interested or not, they started flipping through it. And I would have people call me and thank me. And even later on, I would have tell people say, I held on to that for 4 or 5 years. Now I want to list my house because of the information you left behind. I'm like, well, that's very nice of you. I joke with people, especially in Roundtree and University Heights and Phelps Grove and so forth. There is not a doorstep I have not been on multiple times and hung my newsletter. And we have to remember there's still a fair amount of people out there who are not on Facebook, who are not on the internet, and don't take the newspaper, or they may take a digital version. And so this gives me that opportunity to get them that information. People seem to like it. I haven't done it in a while, and I kind of held off during COVID because people were kind of getting weirded out. They're showing up on their door.
Right.
And today what's a little more unique is everybody has Ring doorbells, so I never know when somebody's going to be saying hi to me without going up there or yelling at me, but most of the time, hi. Yeah.
So you're going to start it up again then?
Yes, I'm going to bring it back out again because, again, talking to neighbors, and I have people show up with my presentations, and I'm still amazed how many people are not on computers or don't want anything to do with Facebook, Instagram, what have you. So if I'm going to get the information out there, I'm going to have to physically bring it to them.
I want to take a little side road here for a second. You've been a realtor now for a long time. You were telling me that there's some things that you can say and you can't say. You know, you might know somebody, for example, that would really love to buy a house that you're going to list for them. But what are the rules?
So Missouri's a non-disclosure state in the sense that if somebody died on the property, something to that effect, we don't have to disclose a lot of those things. But what we do have to is if I'm working with and they're my buyer, and they say, hey, Rich, I want to know, did X, Y, or Z transpire on this property? If I know and I probably do, if I know, I have to disclose it. Even if I was working for the seller and the buyer, via dual agent. And I tell people when I do listings up front, it's like, look, if you don't want to disclose it, that's fine, because you don't have to. But if somebody comes out point blank and asks me, has anybody ever died in the house, or somebody been murdered? Has the house been caught on fire? Things of that nature, I have to disclose that if I know. And so it's always kind of interesting. So I will get some clients just for that reason, because they want me to do a kind of a broader research on a house before they purchase it. Because pretty much most people, when they're looking at a house, they're only looking at whatever the agent wrote in the description and whatever the seller opted to put into the disclosure. And beyond that, most people don't know too much about the house other than they bought it 10 years ago.
And the other thing is, if I remember what you told me, you're not allowed to tell the homeowner about your buyer and how much they might love the house and all that sort of thing, because you get into some kind of issue about discrimination.
Yeah, some of the new rules come into play. For years, we used to call it a love letter. And basically, it was a letter that a client would like to submit with their offer and talk about how they would like to bring up their kids there, or have their daughter come down the stairs during her wedding day or for prom and different things. And, and sometimes that would tip the offer into their favor, which is the whole reason people would write it. But in today's world, because the family dynamic has changed dramatically, you can't do that, because not everybody can offer that same type of experience. And if you got an older person, it makes it more difficult to explain. So today, pretty much the offer is supposed to stand on its financial merit, period. And so we even actually have on our contracts now, check no love letters. And that just keeps you clear. You don't have to worry about it. Will somebody still try? I'm sure they will.
But you're just not supposed to be part of it.
You're not supposed to anymore. And it's unfortunate, because there are some people that really, really, they need something, because the offers sometimes can be very, very close. And they're just trying to find something to disseminate why I should pick this one over the other.
Well, I know in our personal situation, my wife and I lived in the same house on North Benton for 34 years. And I think the fellow who ended up buying it did this on his own, but he wrote this letter about what a nice job she'd done with the house and how he wanted to take care of it. And it worked.
Sure.
It did.
It does. And over the years, we've submitted a bunch of them to people. And, it's some people are in tears reading them. They're like, oh, that's so sweet. And I agree. I think they're wonderful things, but people have been sued now over it. So it's something that we just warn people.
I understand.
Can't go down that road.
Well, again, as I said in my intro, I don't know of anybody. I would call you the neighborhood savant in terms of your knowledge of neighborhoods. Having lived in University Heights, I thought our listeners would like to know maybe more about that particular zoning issue, but also the history of University Heights, because you've kind of lived and breathed that. So let's start. Tell us about just the neighborhood in general and about its history.
University Heights was unique because it was one of the first neighborhoods that was actually designed with the intent of having a garage and an automobile. It was also a restricted neighborhood in the sense of its building design. So where somebody like that lived in Phelps Grove or Roundtree, which were older, you take Pickwick Place going back to 1890. Then you have like Colonial Place to the north of Phelps Grove, and that's like 1908. This one, since it was designed in 1925, they've opted to put on there the houses had to be built of brick, stucco, or stone. So that really kind of limited what it could be. And then so financially, that was more expensive than wood. And this was supposed to be considered a mid-upper white-collar neighborhood. And so a lot of folks, when they moved down there, it was on the cusp of the city limits, because the city limits was Sunshine. And so you were way, way out there. And the choicest lots in University Heights were at National and Sunshine. And why was that? Well, the largest lots were basically facing the country. There was not much else beyond once you cross Sunshine.
Let me just interject here. I've lived here almost my whole life, and I remember National Avenue when it was a 2-lane road.
Mm-hmm.
And it had these enormous elm trees on both sides of it that formed a canopy.
Sure.
All the way from Sunshine toward Walnut. I don't know where it it ended exactly. I guess probably around what was SMS in those days. So those yards would have been much bigger.
Oh, much larger.
They had sort of an estate.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, when you look back, I've got a few pictures from even the 40s, and, the yard just looks so deep.
Right.
It looked like you had to drive quite a distance to get into the yard. But that whole area, when it developed, it was really kind of a top-notch area. And when I moved in, I ended up kind of reinvigorating the neighborhood association. And made a web page, and I got to talk to people that they or their grandparents had owned lots and had bought it with the intent of building in there someday, because to them it was so exclusive. They thought they made it if they could have a house in University Heights.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hi, this is Ranceberger from the Springfield Daily Citizen. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Corey Madison. And Corey, you and I made history here at the Daily Citizen.
That's right, Rance.
The first duo to have a double byline on a story.
For journalism people, or at least for this journalism person, that is the dorkiest, coolest thing. We each put in some work onto a story and get it in the best shape to put it out there into the world.
Teamwork makes good journalism, and our team certainly can't do our jobs without the help of subscribers like you, subscribers to the Springfield Daily Citizen. In Our Town listeners can get 15% off an annual subscription by going to sgfcitizen.org/town. That is 15% off an annual subscription at sgfcitizen.org/town.
And I'd like to point out that I think I was the first name on that double byline, the first one in history. You might have gotten the first billing on one that's followed.
That's all right. Second billing is still pretty good.
For a lot of people that aren't real familiar with real estate law, there are what are called covenants that get recorded on the real estate record. So before you buy the house or a lot, you know what the neighborhood requires you to do in terms of architectural conformity. And I know John Q. Hammonds did that with Southern Hills, for example. And even in, it's probably 30 years ago, after all those homes have been built out there, he still personally approved the plans for every house that was built.
Yeah.
Now, there's some things in those covenants that are not legal.
No single women, and that's kind of humorous today, but back in the time frame, they were worried about prostitution. There was unfortunately no minorities. So as times have changed, all of those have been pretty much eliminated. So the ones that are still really in place were the fact that it's supposed to be a residential neighborhood with brick, stucco, and stone houses.
So the covenants that are in existence now, assuming they're enforceable, you couldn't go in and put in a duplex, for example.
Yes, yeah, that's the way it was designed. And to my knowledge, I can't remember any of them being there. The closest duplexes were in Phelps Grove. So it was supposed to be pretty much all single family. And so nobody in a million years ever thought that would ever change up until recently. But that's all between the attorneys and citizens over there who live in the neighborhood. They got themselves quite a little situation going on.
Well, yeah, it's been in the papers and on TV and so forth. And I know you know a lot of the homeowners and have been to the neighborhood meetings. So tell us what's transpired up to this point.
Well, up to this point, Mr. Duda, who has acquired all the property that is in question, of course, he'd like to rezone that and put a apartment complex there.
Let me stop you there. You say all the property. What has he purchased?
So basically the corner of National and Sunshine up to University, and then one house in on University, and then down Sunshine almost up to Kings. There's one house that he has not acquired there. And then, of course, there's some houses on University going towards Kings. It would be on the south side of University he has not acquired. The intent is, from what he is exposed to the press and the media and so forth, is to build a 3-4 story complex that would have apartments and then shops, restaurants, and what have you in the bottom. Obviously, the neighbors over there are none too happy. It would have been nice for any developer, and I bring this up to people when I'm doing my history talks, that if you're going to go into a historic area, it's always best to try to reach out to the folks who are there and kind of find out what they want, what could be of interest, work with them, be a partner with them, and not come in and tell folks, hey, this is the way it's going to be. So that's kind of where we are. So right now it's still pending with city council. In fact, I don't even think it's been through the zoning board yet. So I think that's still in progress. And there's, from what I understand, 2 lawsuits in place right now as well.
Well, what we saw with this particular zoning issue and with the controversial zoning issue at Galloway, based upon my experience, unusual in this sense. Real estate developers rarely buy something that needs to get rezoned without knowing it's going to get rezoned. Because what if you go in and spend a lot of money and then the Planning and Zoning Commission or the City Council refuses to zone it? You're stuck.
Sure.
And so the typical way that's done is you sign a contract and you're going to close contingent on getting your zoning through. But both in the Galloway situation, for whatever reason, and here that wasn't done.
No.
Do you know why? Or
if I were to guess, I would assume that both parties just thought it was going to be a slam dunk, that people would be happy to see something transpire there. And again, if they had done research and spoke to the folks there, they would have found out very quickly that wasn't the case at all. And it's been interesting. There's a lot of similarities in the way that the projects are both presented to the neighbors and the feedback and so forth. And again, if they could have one meeting up front, they would have realized that this was probably not going to be as successful as it could have been had they met with folks first and kind of found out. A similar thing transpired in Roundtree, where a gentleman followed the rules and built an apartment complex that didn't quite blend in with the neighborhood, which really irritated a lot of the neighbors. And so with their new overlay, they're trying to...
That's the area on...
Cherry. And it's not far from Cherry and Pickwick. And so with that in place, that neighborhood does have an older overlay. They're working on a new one to try to help slow things down so people can breathe and kind of figure out, does this make sense, and work with the neighbors. And University Heights doesn't have that in place. So that's something that would have been helpful, but is not in place as of yet. So the overlay for the Roundtree area, we were working on now for, about 3.5 years. So it's just been brought to the neighbors, so it's got to go to city council for approval.
Well, I was around when the city widened the intersection there at Sunshine. And that house that has subsequently been torn down lost a good bit of its front yard.
Oh, yeah.
And certainly it depreciated in value as a consequence of that. And so the city bought the house. And I'm told it was represented to the neighborhood that it would remain single family. Now that's secondhand.
I heard the very same thing.
Okay. Why don't you tell our listeners what a remonstrance petition, as you know, it's where it takes a supermajority. If you get enough people up to oppose the zoning, it takes 6 votes rather than 5 votes to pass it. And I know there's been some talk about some people on council feel like they need to disqualify themselves. So the speculation is, the reason it hasn't come up for a vote is that the developers are waiting for the council election in April and seeing if maybe there'll be more people who would favor it. What do you know about that, if anything?
Well, I mean, that could happen. You just never know. Just like with anything with politics, sometimes we're told one thing, and then once folks get in there, they do something completely different.
I've seen that happen, yeah.
Yeah, it's happened a few times. We really don't know what's going to transpire there. To me, it's always been interesting. I always looked at Johnny Morris. Johnny took that incredible mill down there in Ozark and moved it off its foundations and restored it. And people complained about how costly things are, but here it was done right. It's going to stand easily probably another 50 to 100 years. And everything down there is just absolutely wonderful. And a lot of developers complain about, it's so expensive to redo something that's currently in place, kind of like the Hers building. But again, we now have it for a long time. Once these things are torn down and thrown into the dump, as I like to tell people, I said, if you want to visit Springfield's history, all you have to do is go up to the city dump, because that's where most of it's laying. And it's sad, but it's unfortunately true. And on my way in today, I was amazed just driving even downtown how much open, empty commercial spots there are that are available. So I know that, for somebody who's a developer, they have to build. That's how they make their money. And they need to have projects. But somebody who's looking to occupy, a commercial spot, it's like, my gosh, there's a whole slew of empty ones around town.
Is there any offer or counter offers going back and forth, as far as you know, between the developer and the neighborhood?
That's something I have not heard. It's something that it would be interesting to see what would transpire there. My take is that it's going to come down to possibly either a heated deal at city council or these attorneys are going to get involved. And I point across the street and look at it, and it's like, well, it's not, it's empty, half empty, and not a lot of traffic over there. When I look at this logically, it makes no sense to me. But it's one of those things that there's obviously people much smarter than I that think it's something that will be successful.
Well, we'll see, won't we?
Yeah, we will.
In the few minutes we have left,
Sure.
I'd like to just talk about what you find so rewarding about history and research.
I got lucky because I grew up in the St. Louis area, and our history goes back over 400 years. And down here in Springfield, we're about 200 years thereabouts. And it's all the places I go, I have always explained to people, Springfield is a big little city, and it's very interconnected. And so sometimes I'll dive down a rabbit hole searching for a house and find all sorts of people and other entities that are connected to it. And it's fascinating. And I love sharing that with people. I don't charge to really do it. Some people have offered to pay me, but I just never know what I'm going to come up with. Sometimes I'll hit a plethora of information, and sometimes I could spend 5-6 hours and find 2 pages of stuff. But I like sharing it because I think it's important for folks to know the history of their area they live in and the house they live in. And I think a lot of things wouldn't be torn down or approached the way they were. People actually knew the history.
To some extent, it kind of knits the community closer together.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's something that's missing today is that when you go back up to, let's say, 1950s and so forth, most people knew everybody and they knew what was being built and so forth. And today, the city has spread and spread and spread, and there's been lots of changes and so many more new people moving in here. And so I do get the person on my Facebook page say, hey, I just moved here, and boy, I really am enjoying reading all this because I had no idea any of this was here. But I hear that from people who grew up here as well.
Well, let me ask you this. What really interesting fact to you about our community is not well known?
Well, I think the biggest thing is realizing that how many non-selfish people gave a lot of their time and energy to grow this community, and a lot of their names are not known anymore. And so a lot of things that we have, buildings, businesses, and parks and stuff like that, people don't know why they're there or who went through. I mean, most people know John Q., but then when you get into John T. Woodruff, well, they're starting to get fuzzy on that. And then you get into Mr. Campbell, and how it came about. And it's almost akin to asking people who's the president and so forth. And they're just staring at you and they can't tell you things. And so to me, that's very interesting. Again, going back to knowing how did this town develop and why are we here?
Well, Richard, I want to thank you for your work and spreading the word. It's great to have you as our guest today on In Our Town.
Well, it was great being here. I really enjoyed it.
That's it for this week, and many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/In Our Town, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.